Right, so let's move to the second part of our panel now. Joining us for this segment, we have Stephanie Holsworth, Associate Mobility Specialist from UN Habitat, Rob de Jong, Director and Head of Sustainable Mobility at UN Environment, and we're also very pleased to be joined by Omnia el Omrani, International Federation of Medical Students, Global Youth Advocate for road safety. So a very warm welcome to all of you. Stephanie, let me start with you because we were just hearing on how some cities have been working on the 30K rule. Obviously, many cities, particularly in the developing world, in poorer countries, are growing and developing very quickly. What do you see as the specific challenges they face on road safety?
One of the issues that we can see is that transport investments are very often focused on very large infrastructure for private cars to cater for that ever-increasing transport demand that comes from the urbanization developments. And with speed over 50 kilometers per hour, as we have in many of our cities, private cars and motorized transport might not necessarily be the safest mode. So investments in sustainable and safe urban transport, particularly looking at the modes of walking, cycling, or also the modernization of public transport, should be accelerated much more. But we have seen that those investments have been particularly slow in low and middle income countries. And this is happening although non-motorized transport accounts for the majority of the trips. I would just like to share the example from African cities where we have found out that 78% of people walk for the everyday travels with an average time of 55 minutes. And what's also important to note is that those people don't do it out of choice, but rather out of necessity, maybe due to a lack of affordability of any other modes. At the same time, we have more than 80% of public transport run by informal businesses on the African continent, and also their operations and their business models are put in place in a way that they create very unsafe services. So we really have to look at how do we now support especially those rapidly urbanizing cities in investments on walking, cycling and public transport.
Rob, if I can come to you, because we've been obviously speaking about making some significant shifts on in terms of the approach to transportation, both for the environment and of course for safety, but really aren't policymakers mainly concerned about getting access to employment and services and about the efficiency of business? How realistic is it to expect this widespread shift to more walking and cycling?
Well, thank you, Mariam. So how realistic is it? Well, the question is actually it's essential. So recently in UNEP, we did some modeling with some universities, and we found that even if we go and take the most positive scenario of switching to electric vehicles, we still will not meet the targets of the Paris Climate Agreement. And that means that in addition to technology change, we need to have more public transport and we need to have more walking, cycling. So it's not a choice. If we want to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, we need to invest in walking and cycling in our cities. And this is possible. Look at COVID. What did we see during COVID epidemic? Many citizens in the cities around the world started walking and cycling. The facilities were not there. Some cities put pylons on the road saying this is not for cars, this is for cyclists. So what we need now is to catch up. We need to provide the infrastructure. And as Stephanie said, in the developing countries, the majority are still walking. We're building infrastructure for the minority that drive a private car. Very expensive. Now we need to, and COVID has given us a wake-up call. We need to now start building infrastructure for walking and cycling. We need it for safety, but we also need it for air quality and climate change.
Omnia, if I can come to you, tell us about how young people are feeling in all of this, because there are a massive growing youth populations in our cities. How important are these issues to them?
So from my perspective, working as a young doctor, but also a global health advocate, I'm part of a global youth coalition for road safety. We have mobilized over 400 members from 93 countries. And we recognize that road safety is the leading cause of death in our own demographic. Over 30% of road crash victims are children under the age of 25. And this means also that more than half of the road traffic victims are also pedestrians, which is really the reality that we are living as adolescents and youth, going to our school, walking every single day. And in spite of us being the most impacted demographic, our voices are consistently underrepresented at all levels of decision making. And nevertheless, in spite of how important these issues are for us, we are working at the front line. We are working to build the resilience of our communities, the capacities of our schools, by doing our local actions in countries all over the world, including countries like Belgium, Rwanda, Kenya, India, and so on. And we have a database of all the activities that are led by young people to specifically address road safety and sustainable mobility. And we also work with our schools through our star rating program for schools. But what I want to highlight is that we really also strongly advocate for 30 kilometers per hour, because we believe that this is the key to protecting and promoting the health of our current generation, but also of future generations to come, because we are the most vulnerable and we need these important laws to be implemented in our cities in order to both, as Rob mentioned, protect our health as humans, but also protect the health of the environment on which our future is depending on.
And Omnia, if I can ask you about the young people that you speak to, you said that their needs and aspirations are overlooked by policymakers. How difficult is it for them to get involved, to try and make sure that their voices are heard in terms of pushing for the sort of cities they want to live in?
Yes, so the main answer to your question would be the very evident lack of a sustainable and a meaningful mechanism for youth engagement. So countries, this is also on a country level and a global level. We do not have a consistent platform where we can share our needs, our activities, but also the demands that we see. As youth, we have evidence-based policy recommendations ready for policymakers to integrate it. We have that, for example, last year, we have a global youth statement that was adopted based on youth-led consultations that were done in 74 countries. In this statement, we have specific demands that address the SDGs related to road safety and how we envision safer cities. But for our call to actions and demands, as well as commitments to be seen in the policy framework for road safety, we need our policymakers to create that meaningful space for us, a space that is sustainable, that is across all levels of decision making, but also on a bigger scale, we want the decision-making table to be reoriented, to have a space for us, to be part of the consultations that are being done, to be able to voice the needs that we see our communities have, but also the needs of our own demographic. But we cannot do that alone, and we also would love to have the support of UN agencies, for example, like with UNEP and UN Habitat, to really work with us, as well as other civil society organizations, for us to work collectively to shape the cities that we see, that we are going to live on. And finally, we know that right now there is a decade of action being drafted, and we would like to see our needs and us as youth to be a key stakeholder addressed in the decade itself.
Rob and Stephanie, I'd love to get your views on that. Perhaps just a quick thought on Omnia's remarks there. Rob, maybe if I can come to you first, what more can leaders and policymakers do to include the youth and other civil society organizations in their consultation process to really broaden the mechanisms for youth engagement?
Right. Well, as Omnia said, how do we shape our future cities? This is the question, right? And how do we shape them around human mobility rather than motorized or car mobility? Today, we design our cities around how do we get our cars to move. We're not designing our cities how to get humans to move. We need to shift from a car perspective to a human perspective. We need to design our cities around human mobility. And human mobility means we need to create more livable communities. Now, the question is, why is it that we're investing so much money in building roads for cars when with a fraction, 3 or 5% of that investment cost, we could also invest in walking cycling facilities? It's because I think those that are using those facilities are often the ones marginalized. are not the rich people, are not the people that own private vehicles. So we need to go to a system whereby young people, like Omnia, and women, and disabled people, and everybody that's walking and cycling has an equal voice as those that are driving their car. Some cities are doing that, but in a lot of cities we still see investment in the old traditional, build more roads for more cars. In the end, it won't work. We see it everywhere.
Well, actually, it's fantastic to have the views of Omnia on this, because we are seeing the youth in cities all around the world becoming increasingly active on these issues. So I want to get to a question now from Maulin Makatange in the Philippines.
Hi everyone, my name is Maulin Makatangay and I'm from the Philippines. I work with yours, Youth for Road Safety, where we help empower young people to take meaningful action against the biggest killer of youth worldwide, road crashes. As you know, about 1,000 young people die on the world's roads every day, and majority of which are aged 15 to 29 years old. So my question for you, the panelists, especially the policymakers, is what more can we as young people do to get policymakers and decision makers to start listening to us and to start acting on our needs and demands for safer streets in our communities?
Okay, so the question from Maulin is, how can we get policymakers to prioritize low-speed streets and sustainable mobility in our communities? Starting with Stephanie.
Yeah, I think one great example where, let's say, policymakers can meet young people is, for example, through open streets events. UN Habitat has organized and co-organized such events in various cities around, especially Africa, for example, in Cape Town, in Addis Ababa, but also in Nairobi. And those events are really meant to create that awareness that we have been speaking about. And we celebrate the street as a public space. We celebrate the safety that we can experience on those during those car-free events, and celebrate other issues like environmental protection and so on. And those events really also acted as a platform where we had the policymakers come to the street, talk to the people, talk about what the people are actually demanding in terms of transport and what kind of experience they are looking for, and started creating those dialogues, I think, that are urgently needed. And I think Omnia has mentioned the need for those dialogues very much in what she was saying before.
And Rob, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's a bit of a generational issue, isn't it? I think people my age are more like all still thinking about private car use. If we look at young people, they look at mobility completely different. They mix mobility with being online. They don't necessarily want to own a car. They just want to be able to move, to be mobile. So I'm very positive that this will happen. Now, the big question is, how do we get the current decision makers that are not the young people to understand this concept of being mobile rather than, for example, private car use? I think most of it hinges on awareness raising. I think they're not purposely trying to block up their cities. They're not purposely trying to pollute the air. It is, they don't see the solution. And I also have to say, it is not as bad because it's happening everywhere at this moment. I live in the city of Nairobi, Kenya, and they're now massively building walking and cycling facilities. So I think all around the world, we see interest in other solutions for addressing the mobility problems, road safety, climate change emissions, etc., pollution. The problem is we need to support that. There's a lot of lack of awareness. How can you do this? How can you build proper walking and cycling facilities? How can you make sure you have proper mass transit systems? And there's still so much that we know and we're not sharing. We're not sharing how to do a mass transit system from developed country cities to developing countries. We're trying to reinvent the wheel every time again. I think that's, where some of the examples that Stephanie also gave, we can move forward on.
And Omnia, I'm curious to get your thoughts on Rob's comments there about there being this generational divide where perhaps the older generation can sometimes struggle to grapple with issues that, for the youth, the walking, the cycling, they can see the benefits of that. And they want their cities to be designed in that way, but it can be difficult to convince policymakers of that. What particular challenges have you faced in your work, and how have you coped with that?
Yes, so I agree in terms of how road safety can be an intergenerational issue, similar also to the issue of climate change, for example. The cities that we're living in, the planet that we're on, we as a generation will be the ones who will suffer the consequences most of the decisions led by policymakers, and yet we are not the ones making those decisions. And the challenges that we faced is, number one, when we're calling on policymakers with specific demands, they always need to have evidence to prove that. Either it's scientific evidence, but more importantly, community-based evidence. Listening into what the community has to say and facilitating this to the policymakers, which is what we are doing as young advocates. The second thing is to also try to, as Rob mentioned, build community awareness. And this is done by using personal stories, going beyond just numbers of deaths led by road traffic injuries, but talking about the stories of the victims and the families who would lose a family member to a road traffic accident. And it's also important to highlight that as young people, we see a responsibility in making sure that the policies that are formulated are implemented, and we're also holding our policymakers accountable, and we're always asking for transparency to see. We know that many countries have committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, the Decade of Action, and all of these targets that are formulated by the UN, and we see that our role will be to call on them to really walk the talk and implement the actions that they signed on and make our cities safer and healthier and livable for us and for our generations.
All right, thank you very much. We'll conclude there. Thank you very much to Omnia, Rob, and Stephanie.